Fantastic. And thank you, Brittany. And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight on what is a hugely sunny and warm evening here in Oxford. Thank you for taking the time to join us here on Zoom. This is the final part of our Jesus Futures series. I know many of you have attended most, if not all of them. So thank you so much for coming along to this final installment with Professor Susan Jebb. Susan is going to be talking on eating for the future tonight and tell you a little bit about Susan. Susan is a professor of diet and population health here at the University of Oxford and a senior research fellow here at Jesus. She's also chair of the Food Standards Agency. She completed her undergraduate degree in nutrition at the University of Surrey in 1986 and qualified as a state registered dietitian before her PhD at the University of Cambridge in 1990. She remained in Cambridge at the MRC Dunn Nutrition Unit and later became a programme leader at MRC Human Nutrition Research. She moved to Oxford in 2013 to take up a new position as Professor of Diet and Population Health in the Nuffield Department of Primary Care Health Sciences. In 2008, she was awarded an OBE for services to public health. Her current research focuses on how what we eat affects the risk of gaining weight or becoming obese and behavioural interventions that might be effective to help people lose weight or to change their diets to reduce the risk of obesity-related diseases. Her research group mostly conduct randomized controlled trials, particularly in primary care, to identify how health professionals can encourage and support people to change their diet and improve their health. And I'll allow Susan to add anything to that, and I'll hand over to her for Eating for the Future. Thank you so much, Susan.
Thank you very much, Peter. Really kind of you, and great to be here. I've spoken at one of these sessions previously about our work on obesity, and so I was really delighted to be asked to come back and talk about a newer part of our work, but which is being done actually in conjunction with many people across the university, and is much more focused on eating for the future, as the title says, about more sustainable food. The interface with obesity is quite interesting, partly because one of the ways that we can protect the environment is actually to eat the right amount of food and not eat too much. So there's a little bit of an intersection there. But methodologically, there's also a lot in common, because at the end of the day, both when we're trying to tackle obesity and encourage people to have healthier diets, or when we're trying to encourage people to have more sustainable diets, the crux of the research challenge is how is the best approach to supporting people to change their eating behaviour. And that's mostly what I'm going to focus on this evening. So this is eating for the future. That's a big topic. I could talk about it for a very long time. But what I thought I'd do today, given that this is a college talk, is really to focus on the work that we're doing in Oxford and to try to put that together into a package for you, so you get a bit of a feel for the kind of things that my research group are interested in. So if we think of the food system as it is today, we face supply side pressures, instability in global food and ingredient trade, which has really been brought home as having seen what's happened after the invasion of Ukraine. And there's also demand side pressures on the system. Our population is growing, there are big demographic changes, and people are changing their dietary habits, and they want different types of food. And some of the consequences of these big societal changes is that we're seeing a rise in household food insecurity, not just something which is affecting lower middle income countries, but something that we're really seeing here in the UK because of the cost of living crisis. We're also seeing an increased prevalence of obesity and diet-related disease, and the health disparities which exist both within and between countries are getting bigger. On the environmental side, what we're seeing is environmental degradation, because food production is one of the biggest causes of environmental harm. And so as we think about reshaping the food system, we really have got to focus on the future and think through, how are we as a global society, how can we provide 9 billion people, which is the estimated population by 2050, with a healthy and sustainable diet. And that really is a big challenge. I'm going to focus today mostly on the UK, which is where most of my own research is based. But I think it is important to remember that no one country is able to tackle this on their own. Food is such a complex global trade that we do need to think of this in a global context as well. Now, creating a healthier and more sustainable food system has been actually quite prominent in conversations in government for some time. And 2 or 3 years ago, the government asked Henry Dimbleby to do an independent review to inform a national food strategy. And this is an incredibly topical moment to be talking about this, because as some of you might have noticed, the government launched its own response to this review and set out its vision for the future food system in its report, its white paper on Monday. That focused largely on the environmental issues, but it will be followed by a white paper from the Department of Health shortly, which will take on many more of the health-related issues. So what I think we realise when we're thinking about the food system is that we need to be thinking about primary producers. We need to be thinking about processors who turn those raw ingredients into crops into ingredients. We need to be thinking about the way food is manufactured, processed, and then distributed and sold to us, whether that's in conventional physical grocery stores or increasingly online, and indeed the way that we consume food and the types of food that we like to eat. If we're thinking about the future, where can we make the big savings in environmental harms? And so this is an analysis which focuses in on greenhouse gases. And it's quite helpful because what it does is to identify 3 of the really important ways that we can actually make a difference to move towards a more sustainable diet. The first is, if you like, a complete no-brainer. It's about reducing food waste. We still waste a remarkable amount of food right throughout the whole system. And I have to say, in the UK, quite a bit of food waste occurs in the home. So you can see from this table that if we were able to reduce the losses in the food supply chain and reduce waste, we would make modest savings in the greenhouse gas emissions. If people were to switch to a healthy diet, and that means a diet which was low in fat, sugar, not too many calories, plenty of fruit and vegetables, essentially the healthy diet that's recommended in dietary recommendations, which would enable people to achieve and maintain a healthy weight, we get a much bigger impact. So you get much, much bigger greenhouse gas reductions. But then, interestingly, if we go from that conventional healthy diet to thinking about the role of meat, you can see that if you adopt a diet which contains no ruminant meat, so that's really meat mostly from cows and sheep is mainly, you get, again, further reductions in greenhouse gases. And if you were to go not just to removing red meat from your diet, but actually to a completely plant-based diet, so essentially a vegan diet, you get further reductions. And what this really does is to highlight what I think are the 3 important things we need to think of when we're looking to eat for the future and for a more sustainable food system. That's obviously reducing waste. It's about only eating the right amount of food so that you achieve and maintain a healthy weight. And thirdly, it's about thinking about reducing the amount of meat in the diet, particularly red meat. And I'm going to focus in a bit more on that later. So it's perhaps easier to think about this if we sort of think how our diet's made up. So some of you may know the so-called Eat Well plate, which divides up the main food groups which contribute to our diet. And this is what it looks like. This is what the UK diet looked like from the National Survey in 2000. And these were the different proportions of the various food groups which we eat. Now, if you then want to say, well, what would a healthy, sustainable diet look like? It's something like this. And this was an analysis that was done by WWF more than a decade ago now. And what they said is that if we wanted to get this is where we should aim to be by 2020. Sadly, we have to say we're nowhere near that. But the main changes you can see is far more fruits and vegetables than we currently eat. A little bit more of the staple foods, so the sort of carbohydrate foods, pasta, rice, bread, and so forth. And here in this pinky coloured boxes, considerably less meat and dairy products. This is really where the big reduction comes. And so if you look at the strategies that have been produced, the National Food Strategy that I referred to earlier, what that recommended we needed to do was to have a 30% increase in fruit and vegetables, about a 50% increase in fibre, and that's predominantly for health reasons, a 25% reduction in so-called HFSS foods. These are foods which are high in saturated fat, sugar, and salt. And then this one, a 30% reduction in the amount of meat we consume. Now, some people have said, oh, wouldn't it be better if everybody if everybody stopped eating meat altogether? But actually, the National Food Strategy did not recommend that as a solution. And I think the reasons are complex, but very briefly, animals are an incredibly important part of our agricultural ecosystem. And so the thinking is that there is absolutely a place for livestock within farming in order that we can reduce the need to use artificial fertilizers and so forth, and also because they can in well managed systems they can be extremely good for soil and so forth. If you look at global recommendations, this was the so-called Eat Lancet report, which really set out what a sustainable future might look like. It recommends rather greater reductions in meat than in our UK proposals, but otherwise the recommendations are broadly similar. So why such a focus on meat? And I've already talked a little bit about its contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, but that's not the only reason to be concerned that we produce, that's not the only reason to be concerned that livestock are having detrimental effects on the environment. About 40% of the grains which are produced are fed to livestock. And that's a rather inefficient thing to do when we could perhaps be feeding them directly to humans. About 70% of our agricultural land is used for grazing cows and sheep. It's a major source of water pollution. And in some other countries in particular, not so much the UK, of course, it's a cause of deforestation, biodiversity loss, and general land degradation. So you might have heard of late, there have been some discussions about whether we can reduce the amount of methane that cows produce, which would help to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. That's important. It may well be a useful step for the future, but it's not going to solve the overarching concerns there are about the impact of livestock on the environment more generally. So some people say, well, fine to have less, maybe we should be having less, but just better meat and beef and lamb. And there's definitely some truth in that. If you look at the, again, this is greenhouse gas emissions, but you look at the environmental impact of red meat. You can see that beef and lamb are up here at the top, but there's huge variability. And that variability reflects different methods of production. And I'm pleased to say that in the UK, we do have some of the most sustainable ways of producing livestock that we see across the world. So UK beef and lamb is particularly from some of the pasture-fed sources, is going to be some of the most environmentally sustainable, but it is still much higher than you get from plant-based products. So I think we do have to accept that whilst there are more sustainable sources, they are unlikely to be as sustainable as a plant-based diet. So what's happening to our meat intake? Well, for whatever reason, whether for health, whether for concerns about the environment, whether for worries about the price of meat, what we've seen over the last decade is that meat consumption is declining. So overall, there's been about a 17 gram a day decrease in the total amount of meat that we consume. But what you can also see in this chart is that the reductions in red meat and indeed processed meat are actually are reasonably marked. But there has been a marked increase in white meat, that means poultry. And that's really attenuating the overall decline we're seeing in meat. As I showed you earlier, actually, red meat is the most environmentally damaging, but poultry is a not insignificant problem too. And so we should be concerned about this increase we're seeing in poultry consumption. So I want now to turn on to what are we going to do about this, because this is really where the work that my research team come in. We, working in collaboration with others across Oxford in the Environmental Change Institute, in geography, and in the social science division, to really we have a programme funded by Wellcome called Livestock, Environment and People, or LEAP. And that's really a combination of scientists who are working on understanding the environmental impact of meat production, but together with scientists in my team who are interested in how we might actually change consumer behaviour so that people might eat a little bit less meat. And I'm going to spend the second half of this talk really focusing on those behaviour change interventions. When we're thinking about changing behaviour, a slightly simplistic model, but nonetheless I think helpful, is one which is called dual process theory. And what that essentially says is there are two different systems operating. System one is essentially unconscious and automatic. It's the kind of drivers to eat, which mean that we don't contemplate and think terribly hard about what we're putting into our mouth. It just makes automatic, quick decisions. And that's really helpful because we haven't always got time to concentrate and make, deep and meaningful, reflective decisions in every single aspect of our life. System two is the much more reflective system, which requires high cognitive resources. It requires you to concentrate and think about this, to weigh up your values and what you're trying to achieve, and really very much more designed to reflect our long-term goals. So we might, perhaps make a very considered decision about eating for the future and think about what foods would be consistent with that long-term goal to protect the planet. But actually, in the moment, very often, our system one drivers kick in, and we've eaten what somebody presents in front of us before we've embarked on that long-term thinking. So understanding that there are these two different drivers of eating behaviour actually gives us insights into two different types of interventions that we might consider. So if you're using your very reflective decision-making system, it's not unreasonable to think that education or labelling will actually start to impact on your choices. But on the other hand, if you're just choosing the default, you're going with the flow, you're in that automatic decision-making mode, then perhaps we need to think of things which are much more about changing the environment. So we effectively change the default. And I'll give you some examples which hopefully will bring these two systems to life. So let's think first about the system 2, which is the conscious determinants of meat eating, because I think in general, most of us tend to imagine, or at least we like to imagine, that we're very intelligent, rational, reflective people who make clear and conscious decisions about what we eat. And if that was true, then actually we would be able to target those conscious determinants in order to help people change their behavior. So we conducted a systematic review, so that it sought to synthesize all of the available literature to see what people had done on this previously and to work out what it is that might make a difference. And what we found is that there was evidence that education-based interventions enhanced intentions to shift towards a plant-based diet. But there was no real evidence that actually just educating people about the problem was sufficient to change their actual behavior. There was also some evidence that getting people to self-monitor could actually have real behavioral impacts. So that's asking people to monitor a particular behavior, so in this case, how much meat they're consuming, and then guide them towards more plant-based diets. So we went on to conduct an intervention study to see if we could develop further ways of engaging with people who were already motivated to want to eat less meat, but needed a little bit more help. So we took just over 100 people who wanted support to eat less meat. We randomized them to either an intervention group or a control group. And in the intervention group, we decided to make it as easy as we possibly could by offering them free meat substitutes for 4 weeks. So the idea here was that let's make it as simple as possible for people to eat less meat by giving them things which were direct substitutes, so plant-based burgers or sausages or soy mince, for example. So people could continue largely with their usual recipes, but they could substitute in a plant-based alternative. What happened when we did that was that we saw a marked reduction in how much meat people were consuming. So what you see here in this graph is that after 4 weeks, people in the intervention group were consuming 79 grams of meat a day, less than they had been at the start. And that compared to a very small reduction in the control group. Now, the reason this is a trial is because we'd intentionally recruited lots of people who wanted to eat less meat. So it was perfectly possible that once they were in a trial and they knew they were being monitored, that they'd just get on and do it anyway. So what's really important here is to look at the difference between these two groups. And what you can see is it's clear that the intervention group decreased their intake of meat considerably more than the control, suggesting that giving people access to meat alternatives was a very helpful intervention. After 4 weeks, we stopped providing them with those products and we left them alone to see whether we'd made any long-term change in their eating habits. And although what you can see at 8 weeks is there was a little bit of regression back, in fact, their meat intake was still considerably lower 8 weeks later than it had been at the start and lower than the control group. Really importantly, when we analysed their overall diet, we couldn't find any evidence of any significant changes in the nutritional composition of the overall diet. So whereas people sometimes worry that some of these meat substitutes might perhaps contain more salt or more fat, in fact, we found that consuming more of these products had no adverse effects on the nutritional composition of the diet. The second intervention we've done to try to support individuals to reduce their meat intake is very much based on self-regulation theory. So this is the idea that people monitor what they're doing and then they make an action plan for how they're going to change a behavior, and then they reflect on how successful that action has been. Again, it was a similar sized trial, a little bit bigger this time, and we randomized people to either receive this self-regulatory support or to just self-monitor their meat intake. And this was a 9-week online, it was a website essentially to help people change their behavior. What it consisted of was asking people to self-monitor their meat intake. We gave them some feedback on what impact that might have on their health and the environment. We encouraged them to set a goal, then to make a plan as to how they were going to reduce their meat intake, and then later to reflect on how successful that had been. And in the control group, we asked them just to self-monitor how much meat they were consuming. So this time we've got a self-monitoring only group, and we've got a group where we were trying to teach them this whole self-regulatory skills. What happened? Well, after 5 weeks, we saw a significant reduction in both groups in the amount of meat they were consuming. It was greater in the intervention group, suggesting that at least initially the intervention had had a significantly greater impact on their meat consumption. But by the time we looked at 9 weeks, what we saw is there was no difference between the two groups, but both of them had reduced their intake by about 100 grams a day, which is really a very, very marked decrease. And what we think is happening here is that the self-monitoring alone seemed to be making quite a big difference. And people remarked to us that it was only when they started monitoring how much meat they were consuming did it come home to them just how much that was. So perhaps in the past, people remembered when they'd had a steak for dinner, but they forgot that perhaps they'd had a ham sandwich at lunchtime. So moving on now to the System 1 interventions. And what we have here are the interventions which don't rely on us finding people who are already motivated and want to eat less meat. They're interventions which perhaps could be applied in the environment and might essentially nudge people into consuming less meat. And when we looked at the literature, we found that there was a reasonable amount of evidence that some of these interventions would work. So reducing the portion size of meat, that's effective. Offering people meat substitutes, again, appears to be effective. A sort of slightly amusing one about changing the sensory properties, so making it much more overt to people that they were eating animal products appeared to actually reduce the amount of meat they consumed. And some evidence that if you positioned foods differently, then that might also reduce the amount of meat people consumed. So we've gone on to try to study this in a bit more detail, and we've done a whole series of studies, and I'm going to run through them relatively swiftly. So this was an online experiment which was testing essentially what happens if you change the availability of meat and plant-based meals. So it's perhaps easiest to think of this in the context of, let's say, a cafeteria where there might be a range of main courses that you could choose. And in the first example, in each example, there are 4 dishes. And in the first one, only one of them was vegetarian and the other 3 were meat-based. In that scenario, 12% of people chose the meat-free meal. So although 25% were meat-free, only 12% chose that. When we then changed the availability, so it was now half and half, 29% of people chose the meat-free meal. So just by swapping the proportion of the options, we could more than double the number of people who chose the meat-free option. And then in the third example, when you go to having 3 plant-based and 1 meat, almost 50% of people chose the meat-free meal. So what this tells us is that changing availability can increase the number of meals that people will choose, which are plant-based. But it also is a useful reminder that people will always over-choose meat. So even when meat was relatively unavailable, more people chose it than you would have expected. And I've just realized, I think that this slide is mislabeled because this one is the, oh no, this is 25% meat-free. Sorry, I'm reading it aloud incorrectly to you, so I've probably confused you, and I apologize for that. But essentially, as the number of meat-free options increases, the proportion of people choosing that meat-free option increases. But even in the, I'm going to stop there before I confuse anyone else. What we then did, that was an online study, so a little bit experimental. People didn't actually get the meals they'd chosen. And so we then were able to repeat it, in fact, in one of the University of Oxford canteens. And some of you might recognise that this is the cafeteria in the maths building, the Andrew Wiles building. They typically used to serve 2 meat and 1 veggie dish, but they switched to 2 veggie and 1 meat. And what we saw was a 20% reduction in the sales of the meat meals, but no decrease in the overall sales. So it wasn't a case that people were going and having their lunch somewhere else. Another study was done by some colleagues in Cambridge, and what they did was to reposition the vegetarian options, again in college canteens. And they did this over 2 academic years, so they studied an enormous number, over 100,000 different meals. And they had 2 different colleges. One of them where the meat and the plant-based options were really quite widely separated, the way the canteen was laid out. They were more than 1.5 meters apart. And what they found there was if people walked by the vegetarian option first, they were far more likely to choose it than if they walked past the meat option first. But when the 2 dishes were put side by side, as you would see them in a traditional buffet, actually there was no evidence of an effect when the options were very close together. But there's some potential, it would seem, in canteens with more space for essentially just making the plant-based options more prominent. So you're not stopping anybody choosing a meat option, but you're just shifting the default. You're just making it a bit more likely that people might choose plant-based. And we've taken that idea of positioning into some work in supermarkets. This was a collaboration we did with Sainsbury's. Some of you might recognise the look of this store. And what we did was to take meat-free items, which had traditionally been in a sort of vegetarian aisle, and put them in the middle of the meat aisle. So the plant-based sausages and burgers were directly next to the meat alternatives. What we found is that meat-free sales increased by 31% in the intervention stores where this happened, compared to just 6% increase in the control stores. So this was a really marked effect. And in fact, it's quite interesting that certainly in the supermarket that I shop at regularly, this now appears to have become the norm. So those are some examples of what you might call system 1 thinking, where we're changing the default. System 2, where we're trying to get people to think a little bit more about what they're eating. And I want to finish with an example which is around eco-labeling, which, you know, you can probably argue fits into both of those different ways of thinking. At one level, of course, if labeling is going to work, there has to be some cognitive engagement with it. But on the other hand, many of the labels, and you can see some of the variety of eco labels that are around, actually prompt, in some cases, a rather more unconscious impact on selection, in that we just choose them without a great deal of conscious thought. So we were interested in whether these various eco labels do actually lead people to choose a more environmentally sustainable meal. And we did, again, a systematic review, always best to check what everybody else has done, what's in the literature already. And what this showed is that eco-labels did appear to be effective at promoting the selection, purchase, or consumption of more sustainable food and drink products. But it became absolutely clear to us that there was an enormous number of labels that had been tested. And indeed, very often, people were using organic labels as a proxy for more environmental. And whilst organic is certainly lower in some pesticides and other products, it's not necessarily always the most environmentally sustainable choice, because it's often grown in more extensive systems. So we wanted to test, make a truer test of eco-labelling. We started off doing this in a rather experimental way, and we have what we call our Woods supermarket. You may not have heard of it because it's not on the high street. What it is a virtual online supermarket. It looks very like an online supermarket that you might have used looks like, but where it differs, and the reason it's virtual, is that it's a supermarket in which you don't have to pay for the products, but they don't get delivered to your door either. So it's a completely experimental scenario. But what it allows us to do is to test interventions which perhaps could be used in store. And so our first one was to put environmental labels onto products. And you'll see we started with an environmental score, which looks a little bit like the eco-labeling you might see on your fridge or some other electrical devices. And we gave people a shopping list, you can see it on the right-hand side, and asked them to do their shopping. And at the end, we were able to measure the environmental score in what they had, what they'd purchased. Our first experiment, we actually tried out a number of different labels. This is the score that you saw on the previous example, where people could just judge whether it was A, B, C, D, or E. We also tried another label where we just put, we just said what it was, that it was B or D, whatever, and didn't show the full range, arguing that that was a slightly simpler version. And then we tried two other methods where we just labeled the 20% of products which were the most sustainable with a better label, and the 20% in any category which were the worst with a worst label. And these were coloured red and green to try to give that subconscious stop-go type message. What you can see in this study is that 3 out of the 4 labels led to a reduction in the environmental impact in the basket of shopping. That was compared to a no label control group. So 3 out of the 4 did seem to have a positive impact on food purchasing. Interestingly, the one that didn't, and really there was no sign of any effectiveness at all, was labelling simply the foods that are better for the environment. That's quite an interesting message because companies are quite keen to label their foods as being better for the environment. But in actual fact, it seems from this research that that doesn't really change purchasing behaviour at all. What seems to be much more effective is if you were to label those which were particularly bad for the environment. But of course, whilst we can do this in an experimental supermarket, I wouldn't put much money on my chances of persuading the food industry to label products which had a particularly bad environmental impact. So I think it's more likely that if we see eco-labels going forward, it will be more along the lines of one of these two schemes, perhaps most likely something which matches up to other schemes already around. But the big question, it's all very well doing this in our virtual supermarket, but what happens in the real world? And again, we were really pleased to be able to team up with Compass, who are the university caterers. But this time they allowed us to do interventions in their worksite canteens around the country. And this was great because it allowed us to get a much broader cross-section of the population, because I think arguably the academics and the students in the university canteens are probably not representative of the whole population. So what we did was to label, as you can see here on the menus, we labelled each of the dishes with their environmental impact score, and there was also information around the canteen explaining to people what these scores meant. And we had 38 canteens around the country, and half of them had eco-labelling on for 12 weeks and half didn't. I'm really, really sorry to say it made no difference in people's purchases. Of course, whenever you do studies, you always want this to be the thing that's going to change the world. And in this case, it didn't, sadly. But there's a bit of a caveat to that. And that is that when we actually looked at the menu items that were being offered, very often there wasn't really that much of a choice. So on some days, the menus that were being offered varied between a D and an E. And it wasn't as though people had a real spread of foods to choose from. So whilst that was slightly disappointing, we haven't given up on the possibility that this could, in some circumstances, be a prompt to changes in individual purchasing behaviour. But we haven't got definitive evidence that that is the case yet. However, what's been really interesting is, following on from this trial, the company have been working quite closely with us to try to overhaul their menus, because they realised that far too many of the meals they were offering did have a D or an E score. And what that's led us to think is that perhaps labels might have only a modest effect on consumer behaviour, but they might be a prompt to wider system change, encouraging people providing food to offer more environmentally friendly choices. Or indeed, if you think in the supermarket, it might encourage different brands to compete against each other in order to be able to demonstrate that they had a more environmentally sensitive product. So I think, this is a way of thinking about labelling both as a prompt to changes in behaviour of consumers, but also as a prompt to changes in behaviour for businesses. So what have we concluded from all of this? Well, it definitely is possible to think of interventions which are going to accelerate changes in eating behaviour. And we think that there are a number of strategies which look quite promising to help reduce meat intake in a way that's needed to meet climate change targets. So I've basically run you through most of the evidence for this during this talk, but there's good evidence that reducing portion sizes of meat can work. So having just 10 or 20% less meat on your plate is over time going to add up into a marked effect. We can increase the availability of plant-based meals. Reformulate products. So ready meals, for example, could use meat substitutes on some occasions, or they could increase the ratio of vegetables to meat. We've shown that making plant-based options much more prominent makes it more likely that people will choose them, whether that's by placing them first in the buffet queue, or whether it's about making more of the options vegetarian. It's possible that relabeling might, by displaying the environmental impact of food, might be helpful. I haven't really talked about this, but at the end of the day, I think probably what is needed is about reframing the way we think about meat, so that lower meat diets become the social norm. And it's not unusual to be eating less meat, or to have some days of the week when you have meat-free meals. And then the final one, which I haven't discussed today, but where there is some work going on in the university, in the Department of Population Health, is looking at the pricing of meat and really ensuring that the pricing reflects the true cost, both of the production of meat and the externalities. That's the impact of meat production on the environment. And I think if we were to do that, it would mean that the price of meat went up. And we know that when the price goes up, that tends to reduce the amount that people consume. The concept of a meat tax is never a popular one with the public. People are always reluctant to pay more for food, but it may be one that we increasingly will need to think of as the climate emergency becomes more stark. And so if I was to conclude in what are the top recommendations of eating for the future, I think they're the three things I started with. First, buy what you need. Don't buy more food than necessary. Don't over-purchase, because if you over-purchase, you'll be likely to over-consume. And so buying what you need is about buying and eating the right amount for you. Second, eat what you buy. Don't waste food, because food that's wasted has already incurred all of the environmental harms in that food production. And so food that's wasted is really, it's no win for anybody. And finally, mostly plants. That doesn't mean a completely meat-free diet, but mostly plants. And I guess buy what you need, eat what you buy, mostly plants is in slight homage to Michael Pollan, who has a similar sort of three top tips for eating healthily. So just to finish, huge thanks to everybody who's contributed to this work. As ever, I get the fun part, which is to go out and talk about it, but a huge number of people have made it happen. Very grateful to the Wellcome Trust, who funded much of this work around livestock, environment and people as part of their Our Planet, Our Health programme. There's a huge number of people in my health behaviours team, but we also, as I mentioned, collaborate widely across the university. And some of you will know Professor Charles Godfrey, who was previously a Hugh Price Fellow at Jesus, and who indeed co-directs the LEAP programme with me. And I'd also really like to thank all the companies and the individual participants who make this research possible, because we certainly can't do it on our own. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, for such a fascinating and stimulating presentation, particularly as someone who is a meat eater, but always is like to try to develop and try to reduce the amount of meat. It's fascinating advice from a personal level. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions. And if you have any for Susan, please do type them in the chat box and I'll read them out. But we do have one already from Stuart. Where water is scarce in some parts of the world, is it realistic to switch from livestock farming to plant or crop production?
Oh gosh, you're asking the wrong person there, I'm afraid. So my work is very much on the sort of consumption end rather than production. But Jim Hall, who is in the Environmental Change Institute, is a massive, huge expert on water. And so I'd really encourage you to look up Jim's work. And he's part of our LEAP project.
Fantastic.
Livestock uses a lot of water as well. I mean, that's one thing that I would say. Grass doesn't, still needs water.
Question for Brittany. What do you think of meal box delivery companies like HelloFresh? Do you think they contribute to cutting down on waste?
That's a really interesting question, Brittany, and there's good reason to think that they do, because everything, we waste so much food at home. I mean, something like a third of the waste in the system is at the household level. And so with these kind of meal boxes, which come with just the right amount, then there probably is a reduction in food waste. However, of course, there is a great deal of packaging and all the delivery. They're also probably still a sort of bit of a niche and relatively middle class. So I'm not sure they're going to be the whole solution, but it is really interesting to see the potential that they have. And what I think they perhaps can do is to encourage people to try new recipes, which they've not tried before. Because the reality is, if you're going to try and eat less meat, you actually have to learn some new recipes. It's a bit harder to cook. And so I think that HelloFresh and some of these other food delivery companies are quite good at giving people that kind of inspiration and giving them the confidence and the skills to try new recipes.
Fantastic. Interesting question from Angela. She's wondering, have studies been done on the value placed on meat, especially red meat? She gives the example when people talk in politics about red meat policies, they're vote winners, and meat seen as in linguistic terms as a positive.
Well, that is a really interesting question. So again, I'll refer off to my colleagues. So the brilliant thing about our LEAP programme is it brings together, everybody from the Environmental Change Institute through to the social scientists and onto medical sciences. And so Jamie Lorimer in geography has been leading on much of the social science work, and really thinking about, how people talk and frame their meat consumption, because that really feeds into the sort of social norms and the status. So one of the things we've been interested in is people are very, very attached to meat consumption. It has a real status in people's lives. It's a central part of our festivities and key moments. Big events are often centered around meat. So it's a very, very high status item. And I think that's reflected in our language.
Absolutely. A question from Charles Vincent. First of all, thank you for such a terrific talk. There seem many things we can do as individuals and as a college. Could you comment on the government's response to Henry Dibble OBE? Seems very negative so far, it seems.
Yeah. So Henry Dibble OBE's report, for anybody who's interested in this topic, I really encourage you to have a look at Henry Dibble OBE's report. It's as government reports go, it's astonishingly readable. It's a good book, actually, and there's some fantastic graphics and analysis. So I think Henry did a very, very thoughtful review. His analysis of the problem we face was spot on, and he then came up with a whole catalogue of recommendations. And it's true that government's adopted rather few of those. It's made no comment at all on meat. It's really skipped over that one. It's got some great things on supporting UK horticulture, terribly important, but it's almost silent on the issue of meat. And I think that is a genuinely missed opportunity. It's tricky one.
Absolutely. Yeah. Question from Matthew. Look at the future
Insects.
Food. Insects, indeed, are a sustainable source of protein. They can upscale food waste into protein, normally in the form of flour in the West, use little land and water, and their waste is a good fertilizer. How would you change behaviors to get people to eat insects?
So insects are a really interesting one. So of course, insects are coming onto the market, and we have you can buy them as sort of crunchy snacks and various things like that. Very, very small scale at the moment. However, I think they're so I'll come back to how do you persuade people to eat them? Some people will choose them because they're innovative eaters and they want to try something different. And I guess over time, potentially they start to come into the food system, but probably more likely when they've been processed. So we're not seeing large scale production for human consumption at the moment. I think what's much more likely is we'll see insects as animal feed. And it will be used as a source of protein in animal feed. I think that's more likely to be where they'll start to come into the system. The other thing is that there's been there clearly are some societies where they are important, but yeah, not in the UK yet. I think there are probably other alternative protein. We're going to see a whole raft of alternative proteins. It might be insects, it might be fermented products, or the sort of mycoprotein, things like, corn is a mycoprotein, but there are all a whole raft of other mycoprotein based products. Or indeed, we are seriously now talking, and it is now available, at least in Singapore, of cell cultured meat. So so-called cultivated meat, which is grown from in laboratories in cell culture. And that's the first products have now actually been licensed and regulated in Singapore. So you can have a sort of chicken, I think it's a chicken nugget type thing, which is has been cultivated in the lab. So there's a whole raft of these so-called alternative proteins, which are, I think, going to come onto the market in quite a big way in the next few years. And going back to the food strategy that was published on Monday, that puts a lot of emphasis on these new proteins. And I can see why for government, the technology is exciting and appealing. It's the UK as a real innovation opportunities. But I don't think we have yet done enough research as to how acceptable are these products to consumers. You could imagine, for example, with cultivated meat, some people who really want to dramatically reduce the number of animals that are killed for human consumption might think that this is okay to do because it means you need very, very few animals, but you still get something which maintains the taste and flavor and look of meat. On the other hand, there'll be some people who just want a much more natural, they want to see cows grazing in the pasture and would be happy to eat less meat as long as it maintained the sort of, rural livelihoods and rural lifestyles. So I think consumer acceptability of these new food sources is going to be a fascinating area of research.
In fact, just to skip to the question, so I will go back to the ones that are above it, but from Angela mentioning that there's a farm in Oxfordshire, I believe, for artificially grown meat now.
Yeah, Ivy Farm, I think it's called. Yep.
In fact, what I'll do is actually I'll work back up because I think the questions link best this way.
Iron deficiency.
Yes, is iron deficiency going to be a problem with less meat consumption?
So the less meat you eat, the greater the chance of having iron deficiency anemia, but the chances are relatively low. So I've forgotten the exact numbers, so forgive me, but I think if you look at amongst young women who are the most susceptible to iron deficiency anemia, it's something like 11% of the population who have low levels of iron. So not frank clinical problem, but low levels of iron. And then if you look amongst people who are vegan, it's about double that. So yes, there's a greater risk, but it's still not that common. The reality is whenever you take major food groups out of your diet, you reduce the diversity of the diet, and therefore you have to work that little bit harder to make sure you're getting all the nutrition you need. But for people who are eating some meat, it's probably not going to be an issue.
And I'm going to end with a question because I think that this whole series has been about the future, and I think Ellen's question captures that. I think wonderfully. First of all, she thanks you for the fascinating talk. She says that she teaches geography, and she's currently about to start the food unit with Year 8, who are 12 and 13-year-olds. What do you think is the main message to give them, given they don't have much purchasing power, relatively speaking?
Well, gosh, I'm not sure. Oh, dear me. I mean, food is so important. I think there are so many messages we need to be getting through to children about food. And I suppose that I think it's really important that children understand the link between food production and food consumption, so they understand where foods come from. They understand how, in geography, I think, how food production is embedded in local communities, the impact it has on the environment. So I suppose I'd want them to understand all of that and to have a real respect for food and for the effort and the resources that go into producing it, so that over time they take that valuing food into their later life. I sometimes worry that many of our problems, diet-related problems, come because people don't value food enough. They treat it too casually. They don't make thoughtful choices. They sometimes eat too much. And I think if we can really get people to respect and value food, and that comes from really understanding the true costs of it, then I think that probably is an important lesson for life.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's a wonderful point to wrap up the questions. And to thank you once again, Susan, for a really inspiring talk. I think for us all, a topic that we all have a vested interest in so many ways. And it's also to thank all you, our audience tonight, and across the whole of this series. It's been really wonderful to explore so many topics that relate to our contemporary world and the world of tomorrow with you. I can give you, I think it might be an exclusive insight, because I'm not sure we've revealed this publicly yet, but the next Zoom series we'll run will begin in October, a new monthly one called Jesus International, where we will look at different topics of research across the world with our academics. Again, it'll be across disciplines. We have some on languages and marine zoology on the way, so do look out for that in the emails in the early autumn. Also, to let you know, this will be this I think is the last event for all alumni of this academic year. Thank you so much for all the support you've given us, whether that be in person or here on Zoom. To give you a couple of highlights coming up in the autumn, on the 17th of September, there'll be a chance to visit the new building for all alumni. Then on the 14th of October, we'll be in London again for a special happy hour London drinks, which proved popular. We tried that in 2019. We'll bring that back. And then on the 26th of November, our new collaboration with the Access and Outreach team, the Jesus Shakespeare Project, will be bringing Henry VI Part 1 for you as we start to fight the Wars of the Roses. So do join us for that. But without further ado, thank you once again, Susan. Thank you to all audience. And I hope your weather is as glorious as it is here in Oxford to go out and enjoy the wonderful sunshine and have a wonderful summer. And we'll see you again in the autumn. Thank you so much.